So today we're going to unpack the really complex and, frankly, deeply contested story of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. We're going to dive into the available source material to explore everything from the historical allegations to the modern political criticisms that really define her public image.
All right, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll tackle the central controversy itself. Then, to get the full picture, we have to step back in time to Somalia under the Siad Barre regime. From there, we'll look at her family's alleged role in it all, unpack her refugee story, and then bring it all into the present with the political allegations she faces today.
So, first things first, why is her background such a huge deal? Well, the whole debate really boils down to a fundamental clash between two completely different stories.
On the one hand, you've got this incredibly powerful, celebrated story of a refugee who escapes a war-torn country, comes to America, and rises all the way to the U.S. Congress. But on the other hand, there's a totally different narrative that claims her family weren't the victims of that war, but were actually on the side of the oppressors. We're going to look at the documented basis for both of these claims.
You know, to make any sense of these allegations, you really have to understand the world her family came from. So we need to go back in time, back to Somalia under the dictatorship of Siad Barre.
This timeline really lays it all out. Barre takes power in a coup way back in '69. His rule is marked with conflict, sure, but look at the late 80s. That's when things escalated, dramatically, with a state-sponsored genocide against the Isaaq clan. And then, just a couple years later in 1991, the whole thing just collapses into a brutal civil war. And this number, it's just staggering. This is the estimated number of Isaaq civilians who were killed during what's also known as the Hargeisa Holocaust. And let's be clear, this wasn't just a casualty of war. This was a targeted, systematic campaign, and it's been documented by multiple human rights groups. And if you want to understand the sheer brutality of the regime's intent, just listen to this quote. It's attributed to Barre's son-in-law, a top commander. It comes from documented orders, and wow, it leaves absolutely no doubt about what the goal was. Total extermination.
Okay, so with that horrifying backdrop in mind, let's connect the dots to the specific claims being made against Congresswoman Omar's own family.
This table breaks it down pretty clearly. According to our sources, her father, Nur Omar Mohamed, was a colonel in the Somali National Army. And yes, that's the same army that carried out the genocide we just talked about. Her grandfather had a major civilian post, so the allegation is that these high-ranking positions made them complicit in the regime's horrific atrocities.
So here's the crucial distinction we have to make. The difference between association and direct action. The sources confirm her father's high rank. They confirm the family's elite status. But what they don't do is provide a smoking gun. There is no public document, no eyewitness account that directly ties him to ordering or personally committing war crimes.
In that context, her family's elite status, it leads us right into the absolute heart of the conflict in her personal story, the real reason they fled Somalia. This slide really puts the two narratives side by side. Her official story is that her family were victims fleeing a brutal civil war. But the critical narrative completely reframes that. It argues they weren't fleeing persecution at all, but were actually fleeing accountability as the regime they supported was collapsing around them.
Now what's interesting is the actual timeline of their journey isn't really in dispute. We know they fled around 1991, spent 4 years in a refugee camp, and were legally granted refugee status. So the debate isn't about what happened, it's about why it happened, and whether their family's privileged status under that old regime changes the very meaning of their refugee story.
And that brings us from history right up to the present day. We're going to shift gears now and turn to a different set of allegations. These aren't focused on our family's past, but on her own political ideology. And it's really important to note that these next claims come from a specific and very critical source. So, a central criticism here, coming from an Islamic cleric on a YouTube channel, basically frames her entire political approach as being fundamentally anti-American. This source calls it pure Islamism and claims it's an attempt to impose religious values on the government.
Now, to get the next set of claims, you have to understand how this one particular source defines the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR. They label it a terrorist entity and the propaganda arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's crucial to point out that this is a highly controversial definition not shared by the U.S. government.
Okay, so building on that controversial definition, this source then makes some incredibly serious accusations. It claims Omar is directly connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, even equates the group's ideology with bin Laden's, and flat out says she loves Hamas. And the evidence this source points to is her advocacy for certain prisoners.
So what are we supposed to do with all of this? We've got these conflicting pieces of information, these different narratives. How do we even begin to reconcile it all? Well, this last part looks at that core tension that really defines her entire public story.
Ultimately, you can't really understand this controversy without holding both sides in your mind at the same time. You've got the documented history of her family's high-ranking position within a brutal regime on one side. And on the other, you have these very sharp contemporary political attacks on her ideology. And her critics are constantly using that history to cast doubt on everything she does today.
And so we'll leave you with this question to think about. When you have any public figure with a complicated, debated past, where do we draw the line? How much do we weigh that history against what they're doing right now? Is it about who they were or who they are today? It's a huge question, and it goes far beyond just this one politician.